We're live.
We're live.
So welcome, everyone. I'm Carmen Rios, feminist superstar, and I'm so excited to be here today with you, Soraya Chemaly, award-winning author, activist, cultural critic, and we're talking about your amazing book, All We Want Is Everything: How We Dismantle Male Supremacy.
Male supremacy and white supremacy. It's
They're
in there.
intertwined, which we will definitely talk about. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. I
And
love talking to you.
I'm very excited. And I mean, the last time we spoke, you had put out Rage Becomes Her, your book about women's anger and the power that we could harness with it. And of course, you've written a book about resilience. You've also written about, everything from gender norms to free speech to gender-based violence and technology. What leads you to what I really consider this manifesto? Like, what was your manifesto moment? What was your journey to this book?
I think my manifesto moment was that no matter who won the election in 2024, there would be this very deep and very violent backlash against progressivism, against women, against diversity. Um, and that the one thing that maybe wouldn't get as much attention as was due was this through line of male supremacy, the way it cuts across all forms of oppression. It gives them a kind of thread that can be pulled through different forms of power. And so if Harris had won, that backlash was definitely going to happen.
Mm.
And if Trump won, the backlash was going to be institutionalized. So I thought, well, maybe just this small kind of dense primer on what to look for, how to recognize it, how it works in our intimate lives and our work lives and our political lives. And that's what this is.
Absolutely. And I mean, you open the book with an open letter of sorts on sort of the phrase at its crux, right? Male supremacy. I feel like a lot of us have heard about sexism, about gender
Mm.
equality, about patriarchy, but we don't often hear the phrase male supremacy.
Mhm.
And like, I feel like there's so many questions I have for you about the way that you give us a new vocabulary in this book. And it really starts with that phrase right there in the title. So why is it that you build the book around male supremacy, not patriarchy, not sexism?
Right.
Like, what's that deliberate choice?
I mean, you and I have been doing this for a long time. And the language that I certainly grew up with was of patriarchy and gender equality. And those words are important and they convey a lot of information and they mean important things. And the way I would categorize them is that patriarchy really describes the institutions of male dominance. And that ranges from heterosexuality, heterosexual marriage and norms, to the education system, to the legal system, to the religions that we mainly practice. Those are institutions. Gender equality is really a way that we measure what's happening around us, right? Is there equality? And in fact, in the end, what I try and explain in the book is that that is male supremacist for the most part, in that most people felt that gender equality meant women should have what men had,
Mm. Mm.
right? If men had jobs and got X amount of dollars, that's what women should have, right? Neither particularly lends itself to understanding the complex intersections of everything: race, sexuality, gender identity, whether you have disabilities or not. Like, they don't capture that complexity. Male supremacy, however, the way it is defined, does that. And so I'm actually going to take the book and I want to read it because I was struggling. I was like, how am I going to define this? And I thought, why reinvent the wheel? Because the Institute for the Research on Male Supremacism has done such a great job. And this is their definition: the belief in cisgender men's superiority and right to dominate, control, or erase, quote unquote, others. And that means women, trans, and non binary people, and those with indigenous, fluid, gender, social roles. And I think that's a good start for the problem we have. And I think too that what's important about male supremacy is it goes to the heart of the others, in that it's a belief system, right? Where you have to talk about the beliefs that maintain white supremacy, that maintain patriarchy, that maintain gender inequality.
Right. And I mean, you actually call male supremacy a connective tissue that binds and reinforces those other things, right? White supremacy,
Right.
xenophobia, homophobia. And you also call it the superstructure of racial capitalism, imperialistic war, and environmental collapse.
Hmm.
And so, why is it that, you know, where there's so many interconnected and overlapping crises and structures and systems at play, what makes
Hmm.
it that you think that male supremacy is really that driving force in there, that like an undergirding force that connects all of them?
Right. So the first thing I would say is that masculinity is there are infinite variations. And so I don't want to confuse male supremacy with notions of masculinity, right? What makes a man in Beijing is very different from what makes a man in Dallas, right? So let's admit to the masculinities as this broad and ever changing thing. But male supremacy in terms of a belief system is pretty consistent in that it is that men and maleness and masculinity, regardless of its manifestation, is actually superior to femininity, women, femaleness, right? And I think we can see that in many places around the world. And what I try to explain in the book is that that structure, that binary structure, first of all, that oppositional structure, is a structure of thought. And so in Western thought, we inherited binary, dualistic, oppositional ideals about men and women, but we see them similarly operating in whiteness and blackness, culture and nature, um, and all of these other pairings. And even though we are told that those are complementary, like men and women are complementary, our experience clearly shows that there's a hierarchy, right? And in fact, for many people, the fundamental juxtaposition is between oppressor and oppressed. The minute you have that structure of thought, you're going to have people who exploit and people who are exploited. And in that structure of thought, women, Black people, Indigenous people, the land that we stand on, the water that we drink, the air that we breathe, all fall on the dominated, subordinated class. And so male supremacy is one of those things, but it is the mechanism by which all of the others are managed.
Mm, absolutely. And, something that struck me sort of from the get go about the phrase male supremacy is that reading it, speaking it, seeing you really like insert it into sort of familiar stories, right? Like you tell stories in the book, and there's experiences a lot of us can probably relate to. Because it's just the experience of being marginalized, of being a woman. And to sort of insert the phrase in there is a revelation. And it feels also like an act of refusal, right? Naming it,
Yes.
acknowledging it, that's how
Yes.
we can begin to see it, to call
Yes.
it out, to divest from it. Um, and once we see it, we can't unsee it,
Can't
right?
unsee it.
Like,
And it creates understanding, right? Like
yes.
we don't we have been dealing, I think, with this deliberately cultivated void, hermeneutic void, right? Where you're not supposed to say, it's like, do you remember when you couldn't write or say white supremacy? Like in 2013, if I wrote white supremacy and if I wrote white male supremacy in an article, it was taken out,
Mm.
right? It was considered too aggressive or an attack or not a fact. And we've come maybe to feel a little more comfort in certain parts of the world with the words white supremacy, but we still don't think of male supremacy. And so it gets erased over and over and over again. Like when you look at certain incidents of violence and they're clearly being perpetrated over and over and over again by men, they might be white supremacists, but they are always male supremacist also, and yet you don't see those words. You don't see the masculinity and the gender part of the violence are taken out.
Absolutely. And I mean, when I was doing my podcast for Ms. Looking Back, Moving Forward, particularly in the episode about gender-based violence, it's eye-opening to think
Yeah.
that sexual violence, domestic violence, these things are not new. And yet we did not have language for them
Right.
that clearly made it visible and obvious that they were not okay, that they were not right until the 70s. And,
That's right.
so some of us are growing up in the tail of that, right? Like that it feels as if this concept has been around forever, but it's actually like, no, it just used to be called life and no
Yes.
one could use the word to describe it. And also, it that when we don't reveal the system, when we, like you said in the book, like when we say sexism or inequality, it feels like an accident. Oh, it's benign.
Right.
Whoops.
Oh, let's get more data.
Yeah. Oh, oops.
Yeah.
We only hired men. That's so weird. That's so crazy. Oh, oops.
Yeah.
Like, we teach boys these things growing up. We totally didn't even realize that. And it's like it pulls that cover off with a phrase like male supremacy of it's not benign. It is on purpose. It is a system. People are making conscious choices, even if they're
Right.
making their choices in a system. And, you give us so much new language in the book. You raise us our emotional labor and mental load with phrases like emotional servitude and submissive generosity and obligatory compliance. And it's like all of these words are eye opening. They make us think about the real intentionality behind it, this systematic advancement of male supremacy, of the
Hmm.
suppression of women and the oppression of women and non binary folks and everyone on that spectrum. So what do you sort of hope changes about the story that we tell with the words that we have? What changes about the story that we tell about our lives, about the world we live in when we name male supremacy and stop pretending that this systematic diminishment of our lives
Hmm.
is a series of happy accidents?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny when you were just talking right now, my brain immediately went to my own childhood as a young Catholic girl.
Mm,
And I was a prototypical firstborn good girl Catholic, and I wanted to be a priest, and I didn't know I couldn't be a priest. And that happened when I was about 11, and no one could give me a really clear, good idea why not. And I thought, surely it can't just be sexism. And I spent the next, 10, 15 years, including through college, at Georgetown, which is a Catholic university. Some would argue not, but it's a Catholic university. Um, and I concluded that in fact it is misogyny and it is sexism. And that's just what it is. But the reason I say that is because so much of my own childhood socialization required teasing out what is good from what is very harmful and self-harming, right? How to be a kind and good person without being a like self erasing myself in the model of femininity that the women in my family embodied, which was totally sacrificial, totally at the service of the people around them. And I think that's how we learn. And so what I would want is that we stop sort of thinking about the what is happening or how it's happening and really home in on why it's happening,
mm,
right? And it's happening for very complex reason. But when you keep peeling away the layers of the onion, it's happening because we fundamentally socialize children to think that men are smarter, more capable leaders, more capable of genius, stronger, which is a whole other thing. Like my entire second book on resilience was basically a book about how we define strength in our culture, which is to adulate masculine virtues, right? That's what it is. It has nothing to do with adaptability and everything to do with this model of manhood. But if we can focus in on the why, I think that it's much more arresting to people because no one wants to do it. Most people, I take that back. Most people don't want to do it deliberately. They don't want to teach children that men are smarter, but by the time children are 6, they all believe men are smarter.
mm,
And we don't say that that's because they've been basted in male supremacist culture, but that is why they believe this, right? It's not like children have to learn these things. They are not born thinking these things. So I like people to kind of forget about the numbers. We've produced more numbers than any human being can possibly absorb. We've analyzed the numbers. We know what the numbers look like. The numbers are actually getting worse right now.
Mm.
And so why don't we focus on why and talk about why?
Oh my God. And I loved when you talked about your Catholic upbringing and wanting to be a priest because hate this for us, but love this for us. I had a similar moment when I was about 13 years old. And I mean, I always say like I was born a feminist because I was raised by a single mom who was,
Hmm.
um, my grandmother was widowed or a widower, whatever the phrase is. And so I grew up only basically raised by strong Italian independent women.
Hmm.
And um, but when I was 13, I just so vividly remember being like, I got it, mom, I've got it. I want to be the Pope. And my mom
What?
was like,
What did she do?
well, she was like, I'm so sorry to tell you this, but you can't be the Pope because girls can't be Pope. And then my immediate next thought was like, cool, I'm going to be the president. And she was like,
Yeah.
I hate to tell you this,
Yes.
and she was like, you could be the one, but no one hasn't. It's going to be really hard because, like, she was always very open about just like, these aren't fair boundaries, but
Yeah.
these are like the boundaries that have been placed on us, that have been pushed on us. And so when I read that story too, I was like, oh, I'm not the only one. Got it.
I'm not. I think many, many feminists I know are just aggrieved, Pope desiring girls. I think many
So
of them
much
are
would
like,
be
wait,
different if
what?
they would open those doors for
Wait,
us,
what? Like, if they would just let girls be priests, then we wouldn't even be here, right? It's so silly. But I think a lot of us have that moment when we're like, wait, what? Especially like I don't know, I was tied at the hip to my brother who was 2 years younger. We were really best friends, and that moment, I think I even put this in the book, it was really the first break for me from him. Because when he learned I couldn't be a priest, he kinda cackled. He was like, "Ah, ha, ha, I ca" "You're siblings, you're really
yeah.
close." And that moment was just a moment of, "Wait a minute, you're supposed to be on my side, I'm always on your side." And if we were no longer on the same side, and I just remember that so clearly.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it speaks a lot too to what you talk about in the book about how we can make male supremacy and privilege invisible and partially
Yeah,
to make boys feel like, oh, you didn't do anything wrong. But even in this frame of like, well, girls just aren't allowed to do that, it's like, well, the other half of that sentence is, girls aren't allowed to do that because we live in this fundamentally unfair system that says for no reason that boys are better than girls. And,
at
the
doing it.
church
That's right.
the church can have its excuse about whatever, the rib, the whatever it is,
Yes.
they can have their own reason and excuse. But at the end of the day, it's like, oh, we don't want to allow this to happen because we simply don't feel that women deserve this, that anyone but
Right.
us deserves what we have. And it goes unnoticed because you just internalize it as like, that's just the way it is, right? That's the
Yeah.
natural order of things. Um,
Yeah, and it's not only that women don't deserve it, is that women will taint it,
mm,
right? Women are going to sully it. It's gonna cause shame. And that's important, I think, because, you know, if you think, for example, right now of the boy crisis in education, there's a lot of talk about the boy crisis in education, and it's cyclical. This happens cyclically, and essentially the exact same arguments, they get modified a little bit, but they are the same arguments. And among those arguments is this idea that really, truly only men can teach boys how to be adults. That's thing one, very sex segregated. But thing two is we don't talk about male flight from spaces where women are because to be like women is shameful,
mm,
right? It's a degradation. And so boys right now are detaching from education, but we don't talk enough about the fact that before they did that, men left teaching because women started teaching.
mm.
The second one. It's about the desire of from the first minute, go for it. Press deny, put in the energy, covering. And the first one, the first one from Military was even vulnerable. They wanted to show that they were here just to win.
Quality of male flight, that phenomenon happens over and over again. So like the manosphere is a male flight space, right? If you think of digital territories, the manosphere is male flight. Um, and I would argue that in the last election, we saw male flight from democracy, right? We saw young men
Mm,
actively voting against democratic a democratic future and for a more regressive authoritarian future because
absolutely.
the Democratic Party appeared to be dominated by women. Yeah.
Yeah, and democracy was sort of seen as the field of, all of a sudden it's a woman's game to have a democracy.
Right.
And yes, I do. I'm seeing the comments. I lost you for a minute, and I heard
Oh no.
something I don't someone probably someone else's Substack feed. I don't know what that was.
That's so
I'm
funny.
so I was like, felt
That's
like it was like
very
a
you
man
were I
talking.
wasn't sure if you were frozen or not. Well, I was rambling, but enough to say that the stigma, right? The stigma of women cuts across lots of different phenomena. And you it's not just that we don't deserve it, it's that we are actually kind of a poison to the space.
Absolutely. And I mean, that observation about we heard a lot about Gen Z men, boys,
Yeah.
in the context of the election, and also about, high school boys, and sort of that there is this rising tide of sort of anti-feminist backlash happening among young boys and men. And to see you really hit that nail on the head of like, it's because now that politics and democracy are these feminized spaces for justice and equality, they're not interested anymore. It's no longer
No.
like a power structure. And absolutely this idea too that, you know, you call you say that Donald Trump, quote, is not paradoxical if you understand his administration's dedication to preserving a global system that privileges hegemonic masculinity and its outcomes at all costs. And the at all costs or above all else, it makes me think too of, even you talk about tech a lot in the book. It makes me think about, Sam Altman, who
All
was
the guys.
literally unable in an interview to just say, yes, I believe humanity should
How about
continue.
Peter
A
Thiel?
very basic question. Do you
Yes.
believe human life should go on? And his answer was like, he could not respond and he was silent. And it becomes very obvious that what's happening here is, you know, oh, drain the swamp, or like, oh, we need to burn it all down. Yeah, what they want to burn down is the progress, right? They want to, they would rather flatten the entire political system than watch everyone else get a piece of it.
If they can't have that dominance, then they will burn it down.
Absolutely. And, it makes me question if talking about male supremacy, if using these phrases, this new vocabulary that really actually points out what's happening, not like
Mhm.
the effects of it, but the system that
Yes.
underlies it, if it changes how we think about our lives, about gender inequality, like injustice among varying gender
Mhm.
experiences, how does it also necessitate in a moment like this that we change our feminism? I think reading your book
Yes.
made me think about all of the different ways in which there's a lot. I think there's very obvious right now limitations to the work that's been happening, that's
Yes.
gradual and within the system, right? And so what do you think needs to
Well,
change about the way we
yes.
organize?
I think it's really interesting. I think, sometimes I wish I could come back in 500 years and be an historian and just like look and see what happened, right? It's just a very interesting time if it weren't so dangerous, right? Because I think we're going through one of these massive transitions in human civilization, in
Mm.
fact. But having said that, um, I think that the way that feminism has worked to date, for me, is super aligned to the way media has worked, right? Like we are all creatures of media in so many ways. And I don't think we've given nearly enough credit to the work that feminists, and I should say feminisms and feminists, right? Because there is no one feminism. We know this. And we know that often they are at odds. But what's happened in the last 20 years is that feminists around the world have used technology very effectively. And a networked feminism, a global feminism, a digitized feminism is transformational. It's been transformational. And this is even before social media. So I cite a study in the book. All the citations are online, but I found this amazing study that essentially showed it was social scientists globally studying things around the globe, and sometime between 2000 and 2005, so Facebook hadn't even started, but there was enough of an internet, right? A very interesting thing happened around the world that wasn't caused by one particular action or group of feminists, but women all over the world, and this was after, of course, the Beijing conference, but women all over the world began to reject in their personal lives the normalcy of violence in their homes.
Mm.
They started to understand it as not normal and as wrong. And that moment, that was like a tipping point moment for feminism because these weren't academic people. These weren't women sitting around, sort of in small huddles in San Francisco. These were women all over the world having this moment of consciousness that they were some like, they were rejecting centuries of cultural practices in their own countries. And so if you think of that as the basis for a change, and then you see social media's use, data, women are using every form of media to promote feminist ideals, and there's no gatekeeping it anymore. It's not there's no sense that you can control it. It was never really controllable, but it was still, prior to the internet, I think, quite top down in many ways.
Right.
There were grassroots movements and there were working class movements, and I would categorize things like climate movements, environmental movements, indigenous movements as deeply feminist, but they weren't recognized as such, right? But now they're all networked. And I think that's probably really transformational intergenerationally. We just can't see it. And I would say that as far as our feminist practices, I think we're seeing really dynamic feminist practices in action all the time. It's just that because of social and technical acceleration, there's not really a moment to stop and say, what is happening to feminism right now? Because by the time you do that, it's something else.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, feminism is absolutely sort of evolving in real time, adapting and,
Hmm.
confronting what's happening. It just also strikes me as so almost like revolutionary to think,
Yes,
if feminism were to shift from the popular frame of gender equality to like, no, we're here to dismantle male supremacy,
yes,
it feels like that intentionality would necessitate like a massive sort of watershed movement moment of like,
yes.
we need to really change the way we're having these conversations and maybe change the goalposts a little bit and recognize that, inching our way towards, like you said, the standard that men set for no really just arbitrary standards that men set for themselves of
Right.
what their privilege should look like. And just really I feel like it makes it very evident too that it's not about elevating all of us to a place of privilege. It's about, dismantling structures of privilege entirely.
And changing them. I mean, I think the fact is that that's happening. There's not a like. I think that towards the end of the book, I really focus on refusal, right, and just the fact that young women in particular, they may not be taking to the streets in No Kings protests, but they're also choosing lives that completely ignore heteropatriarchal norms.
Mm.
When 30% of Gen Z is no longer identifying as heterosexual and straight, more than twice the Gen Z men, and a larger percentage than any other generation, they are living feminist lives that decenter men, disrupt heteropatriarchy, refuse to conform, and they're doing it quietly in their own ways. It's not like they're waving flags and building barricades. They just are trying to feed themselves. and
Right.
lead lives of mutual care, And so I think too that expecting feminism to look like the revolutions of ye olde days is also just not ever gonna, it's like, that's just not what we're talking about.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, but and yet at the same time, it feels like, you talk about in the book as well, sort of overhearing this conversation between, I don't know if it's
Oh,
2 men,
yes.
a few
No, it was
men
many
about
men. It was several men.
and they were progressive and they were talking about surveillance and their shock and outrage at the idea of a surveillance state. And you point out that for women across the country, especially in the last few years as this has ramped up, but for many years there's been a surveillance state, right? Your local government might be trying to make it illegal for you to leave state lines if you are pregnant and you want to end a pregnancy. You can be criminalized for the outcome of your pregnancy.
Transvaginal, sorry, transvaginal probes that are
Right.
state mandated. I like nobody thinks of that as literally surveilling the inside of a woman's body. It's
Mm.
surveillance, right? Like we're actually doing that in many states. And yes, I'm saying this, yes,
40%, 60%
40%, 40%. Yeah,
of
more
Gen Z women want to leave the
of Gen
country.
Z women want to leave the country and would if they could. Yeah. I mean, that's a big number. But yes, I think that the that conversation that I overheard is quite emblematic because the standards for what counts as real oppression, real surveillance, real authoritarianism, real fascism, again, are largely calibrated to what happens to men.
Mm.
And so we don't think of compulsory pregnancy um, in that way, and we don't actually think of the micro-fascism of patriarchy operating within families, the high rates of violence, the high rates of coercion and control, and the thing that's really disturbing to me about Gen Z is that more than 50% of young men believe they have the right to know where their woman is at all times, and that men have final decision making in relationships. I mean, they are holding very, very retrograde gender ideals. Their gender beliefs are much more like a 75-year-old man's
Right.
than a 55 or a 35-year-old man's. And that should really tell people something. That's very concerning. But by the same token, and we haven't talked about this at all, right up front in the book, I explain that male supremacy is predatory towards men. It's bad for boys and men.
Mm.
It forces them into um, precarity in terms of their own identities and relationships. It forces them into an unhinged model of competition for life. Men have got to compete with other men to win, and that's how I think a lot, if not most, boys and men understand manhood. You know, and in fact, in that model, and thinking about male supremacy as opposed to men oppressing women, the mechanism for oppressing people is to feminize them, right? You put black men in jail. You make it impossible for them to have jobs and support their families. You deny them the guns that white men can have. Like if you look at the history of the oppression of black people in the United States, the feminization of black men, also the feminization of Asian men, if you think about the history of Asian immigrants, feminization is how you oppress those men, and in fact you put them in positions in incarceration where they might be penetrated, where they might be raped. And
Mm.
so even that mechanism of rape, which we think of as dominantly men raping women and children, is used against men by other men to subjugate them
Right.
as a gender issue.
Absolutely. And I think that sort of comes back to this idea when we talk about you know, fascism and how it's been operating for many people. It is this idea that it's new right now to some people,
To
but it is
some people.
definitely not new, right,
Yes.
to people of color, to women who have been dealing with these attacks on their bodily autonomy. And it also, the flip side to that, right, is that in this moment, the people that we should be listening to and hearing from are people who come from communities and,
Absolutely.
and groups that have been
They
dealing with.
know. They know.
Yes. And
Yes.
so it makes me question sort of, as you were writing this book, as you were thinking about this big picture of where we are at and how we got here and how we get
Mhm.
ourselves out of this, what were like the lessons from legacies of, anti-fascist dreaming, of anti-supremacist dreaming that so many people before us have done that really inspired you?
Well, I mean, I think this notion of having imagination, right? A feminist imagination, or if you think about Afrofuturism,
Mm,
or if you think of Black surrealism, you know, if you think about the way marginalized people everywhere have to not just maintain hope, but create hope. They have to project themselves into a future in white supremacist systems that maintain that the future and progress is a property of whiteness, right? I mean, if you think particularly of white men, you think of Silicon Valley,
mm,
that notion of the future, who it belongs to, who defines it is very clear, you know? And yet at the same time, even though that has been true for centuries, we have this explosion of creativity and beauty and music and hope and mutual care. And, you have to, I think, appreciate that the ontology of oppressed peoples everywhere, those ontologies are just very different from the one that we inherited, as a imperial Western power, you know, and I think that's hard because if you grow up in a culture, if you grow up educated the way most of us were educated, you're going to inherit that. And you're going to inherit the white supremacy and the male supremacy and the cis supremacy. And it's very hard to think there's something else because it just feels it's so naturalized, you know? But I think that that idea of having the imagination and understanding that each of us has the right to the future, to define the future, is just really important.
I love that so much. And, um, I'm when I think about how we confront our own right, we're all so entangled in these systems, and we
Yes.
can be self-aware and know about them and learn about them and still be pulling ourselves out of them because it's all around us, and
And it's capitalism, like, you have to eat.
absolutely.
Yes.
And, the book is what I love one of the things I love about the book is that it's not all doom and gloom. It's full of, like, inspiration of these stories of how resistance works and how resistance can work. And you lay out some of these ways that on these small personal levels, we
Mhm,
can start refusing male
mhm,
supremacy, right? I think you call them micro defiances at some
mm,
point, and you talk about decentering as a praxis to sort of cut off male supremacy at its root. And
mhm.
yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you would recommend. Like, if someone were to, what are the small things that all of us can do, even if we don't feel like we have power, even if we,
Yes.
feel outnumbered and we're very overwhelmed in this moment, like on that micro level, on our in our own lives, how can we push back against all of the stuff that
Yes.
that we are so wrapped up in?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that everyone has different capacities and that, there's a great privilege in being able to have health insurance and to feed your family and just have the basic necessities of life, which fewer and fewer people have. And so I think that people should understand that it's important to do what you can do, not have a feeling that you must do, because that's impossible in the circumstances that most people live in, right? But I do think that there can be a lot of humor and joy and glee in the realization that everything is up for grabs.
Mm.
The minute you really start asking why, like, why is it? Like, I was 8 and I remember thinking, wait, why do I have to clear the dishes and my brother doesn't have to clear the dishes? Like, who's making that rule, right? And but that why, that press for why has really, that's where my feminism came from. And there's not a day that goes by when I don't think, wait, why? Like, why exactly? And when you start asking why, you really quickly can often come to, because that's the way it's always been. And once you hit that, you're like, well, I don't want it to be like that anymore. What can I do? And what can I do in my own home or family, right? Like, it's actually, there's so many things you can do that will have a butterfly effect. You just
Mhm.
don't really know what the effects of your small changes are, but there will be effects of those small changes. And right now, a lot of women in the world are actively decentering men, right? That is a movement around the world. And what's interesting about that is decentering men is interpreted by so many people as hurting men, as opposed to just saying, I'm not going to make you the center of my attention, my brain space, my emotions, my life course. I'm just going to lead a healthy, happy life and be self contained and self sufficient. That's very hard for a lot of people to accept. But it's not hate of men, it's not hatred of men, it's literally just independence. And to interpret independence as the hatred of men can only come from centering men and male supremacy, right? Like I don't know
Right.
how else to put it.
Incredibly telling. Yeah.
Incredibly telling, but I think a lot of us fall into traditional gender norms, heterosexual gender norms, because they're easy and because they're rewarded institutionally.
Mm.
And so we need to be able to recognize that and disrupt it whenever we can. The books you read to children, who cooks in your house, who takes out the garbage, who who volunteers or doesn't volunteer. Um, every one of these decisions adds up into a much bigger picture, and we don't really think about it.
Absolutely. And, you know, I know you told me when we were talking back and forth about setting up the conversation, you mentioned that you had to cut a lot from the book. You wanted to keep
I
it,
did.
it's very giftable. It is like
Ah,
the ultimate holiday gift,
small.
a
I
stocking
wanted it.
stuffer. Yes. I'm wondering, of all of the stuff that didn't make it in, is there anything that, what do you miss the
Yes.
most? What's the stuff that you.
Yeah. I think the thing that I really, it just felt like I had stabbed some idea in the heart, and like, I just didn't want to do it. I had a chapter, the structure of a book is really hard. Like, books can take many structures. And the through line in this book is violence, because the only way you maintain supremacist systems, all of them, is through violence. And violence has many forms. And often it's so normalized that you don't even see it. And so, if you think, for example, of people's reliance on the law as a way of delivering justice, the law and justice are two very different things, right? And so, if you talk about rape, like, for years and years, I only wrote about sexual violence. And any part of the world, like in schools, in churches, in war. Um, and people often would say, but it's illegal. Rape is illegal. And I could never understand why they said that. Because, in fact, it's not that rape could technically be illegal, but the system of justice around rape is actually facilitates rape. It
Mm,
doesn't prevent rape. It doesn't punish rapists. And it is a system that turns the trauma of young children and women into a punishment system, right? Like, if you think about particularly young Black women, young Indigenous women who suffer much higher rates of sexual trauma as children, they end up incarcerated because of their trauma, right? Or if you think of the fact that fewer than 1% of rapists ever are punished, that's not a system that makes rape illegal. That's a system that rewards rapists,
mm,
right? Rapists are not being negatively affected by the system of incarceration, unless, of course, you're talking about mass incarceration, which again is a system that facilitates rape, right? And so I had this quite detailed and blunt chapter about violence and all kinds of violence, and it's pretty gruesome. Like, if you really pay attention daily to gender-based violence, it's a lot to take in. Um, and it was, I think, too much for my editor. who I think, I didn't want this to be a super heavy book. I've written books like that. And so we kind of teased it apart and took the important parts of the argument and embedded it in each chapter until it culminated at the end. But I had graphics and charts and tables um, and that didn't make it in.
Well, and that's actually really interesting because when you talk about like it's too much, it's too much for the editor. It's
It's a lot. It's
there
hard.
is that refrain too. I've heard that from a lot of authors, especially authors who are trying to tell maybe their own stories of, I'm thinking particularly, childhood sexual abuse
Yes.
is audiences
It's a
simply are
lot.
like, I don't know that I want to buy a book and read about,
And
and it
you don't want to
becomes
impose trauma on people. Like vicarious
right.
trauma, insidious and vicarious trauma are real things. I suffered that as a journalist. I really don't want to do that to anyone else. So it's a very fine line.
Right. And yeah, and you talk in the book too about when there is sort of all of this news of varying kinds of violence, right? Because I think right now we are seeing the violence of male supremacy. We're seeing state violence, we're seeing
Yes,
gender-based violence and the actual an entire administration that is
yes,
basically like your please submit a resume of your sexual crimes
yes.
and we will
And
evaluate you.
we'll hire. That's right.
Yeah, and so we are seeing these sort of, that's a form of it's like cultural violence, state violence, and actual systems of gender-based violence
Yes,
that are going. I mean, with the Epstein file, she's going completely. It's like, oh, that is not a concern for us at all, and that again is a form of violence. And at the same time, resisting can be really exhausting when it's like coming at you from all fronts, and the chaos of this moment can
yes.
be overwhelming. And you talk about, this very I think all of us do this that you were hanging out with your friends and y'all are just like, we're simply not going to talk about all of the
It
horrible
was a
things that we could be
birthday.
discussing right now, right?
Yeah,
And I'm curious, as someone who writes extensively about heavy topics, I mean, this is something I've had to confront too in my work. I also focused really a lot on gender-based violence for a
yes.
very long time. How do we confront the horrors without succumbing to hopelessness, especially when it comes to, when this book has so many statistics, so much information that it can feel like this sort of like, oh my God, how are we supposed to make a dent and make room for the
Yes.
imagination, right? In a system that is so overwhelmingly powerful. So, how do you navigate that even in writing about it?
Yeah. So you'll laugh because I have a page of statistics after each chapter. And that page of statistics, when I first submitted the book, was 6 to 8 pages of statistics. And and
You're
I
like,
was
I've
like,
written a report for every
I was like,
chapter.
every one of those is really important. We cannot cut any of those. And I'm really grateful to my editor for cutting those. But every single one that didn't make it in, I could probably tell you because I'm like, but wait, it's so important. And so I think there are a couple of things. The incident that you're talking about, um, I think many of us feel it, right? It was last fall, and there were there was 6 weeks there when there were maybe 5 global stories of extreme violence. So or the rape in France,
Mm.
uh, the Pellico rape, the young doctor in India who had been raped in her hospital, the Olympic runner whose boyfriend lit her on fire. There was a Swiss woman. I hesitate to say this, but her husband killed her and put her in a blender.
Oh my
I
God.
mean, I couldn't even. There were so many, and we went to lunch, and you just knew that everybody had these names in their heads. And the reason I used that story was to talk about how backlash isn't just this abstract idea. It lives in our bodies, it lives in our minds, in our relationships. It infuses life because we're forced to watch everything we've been forced to watch and experience in the last year. And that includes, just a complete dismantling of decades of racial justice efforts, diversity, inclusion, stripping, women from senior roles in public space, immigrants and people being picked up. Like we're just subjected to this. And we have embodied responses to that. And so I wanted to really talk about the way that it's easy to make the term backlash abstract, but there's nothing abstract about it. And yet there are people that we live with who aren't experiencing it that way because they are not directly affected by it. And in fact, they are privileged by the harms that we feel, and I just think that it's a real balance because it's so easy to feel that weight. And yet the important thing is, and I remember reading Audre Lorde as a much younger person, and, she says self-care is a political act. You have to take care of yourself, and you cannot allow yourself to be saturated and subsumed. And you really can't. Like that, you just can't because it's easy to get saturated and subsumed. I think all of us have experienced that feeling, that weight, and you cannot sustain it.
Absolutely. And, I know we're sort of coming up on the hour, and I
Yeah.
had well, first of all, I want to say, Rianne, me too. I would also read the unedited version. Serial Substack series, I think.
Yeah.
I would read all 6 pages of
All 6
statistics
pages.
for
I'll
each.
post the pages. I'll find them.
And I totally know your pain because it's like, especially sometimes the statistics tell a story, right? Like sometimes
They
it's
tell
like,
a
I can't
story, like
mention that this is happening to this many people without adding that this is also happening over here
yeah.
because it's obviously connected and it becomes.
And they were in an order. Exactly. I was like, I put the statistics in a particular order. Yeah.
It's like one day when someone's leafing through your archives, they will find like a 600-page manuscript for this
Yeah.
book.
I know.
But something,
And I had
when
a
you
wonderful editor. Like I really enjoyed working with her, and she was very smart about it, and I appreciate it.
it's like, and that is why editors are so critical and
Yeah,
necessary.
that's right.
um, and so you mentioned before sort of this idea of, the feminist imagination, and you assert in the book that, male supremacy's logical conclusion is social collapse, right? And environmental collapse, because
Every
like you said, the land is
death.
feminized
It's just
and
death.
dominated. Um, complete political collapse, which we are witnessing that, like we said, these men would rather burn down any form of a sane government than simply share it with us.
And
Um,
just caring for people.
right. And you write that, where male supremacy reaches a dead end, the feminist imagination begins. And
Yeah.
I love that so much. And you write, this too is a new world order. And it just made me want to ask, what do you think or hope that new world order looks like? What is your vision of the world without male supremacy and all of the other supremacist ideas, right, that it hinges
So
on?
yeah, I think that I was just, this. I was just talking to someone who mentioned the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. And I think that's true because all of the terrible things are happening. And it's almost like a shadow world in which the non terrible things are happening because there are dedicated, good people who are building caring families and communities and neighborhoods, and they're just doing the work on the ground. And they don't have the megaphones and they don't have the money they need. They need money, right? And they need resources. But the fact that they don't have them isn't stopping them. And in fact, when you look, for example, at Gen Z, we focus a lot on the men's rightward turn, but we don't focus enough on the fact that it is the world's young women that are the most dedicated to progressivism and saving the climate and diversity and pluralism. Like, we should be celebrating that. And somehow that cohort across all of these countries ended up with deeply intersectional feminist values. And it's not because they were taught in school. Right?
Right.
Like, something happened, and maybe they did have excellent teachers, many of them, but most of them came to this worldview. It's like Gen Z is 2 generations. They have 2 very different worldviews if you look at it. And they did that. These young women got to this place through necessity and experience. Their entire childhood actually has been Trump and on, but also they did it in the face of backlash. Like every generation has had backlash. Every generation has had backlash, and yet it continues to evolve in this direction. But we have to find a way to socialize boys so that they don't feel that women's gains emasculate them,
Mm.
right? That they're so socialized into zero-sum competitive thinking that it's hard for many of them to even imagine that not existing. And so I just think there's and also I will say this, a lot of people think, well, feminism's fizzled, it's died, and I kind of chuckle because I'm like, every single social justice movement that I can name, any just like the climate movement, the movement for indigenous rights, for Palestine, at the forefront of almost all of them, you're going to find diverse groups of women, often who are queer, and they are leaders of these movements, and yet we don't want to acknowledge the diffusion of feminism across the planet. You know, we're still looking for the feminism that comes in a cute little box that you say, "Here's your feminism," and it's like a swag bag feminism, and that's not what we're talking about.
No, absolutely. I feel that too. Even with, these efforts that we saw over the Thanksgiving holiday, it is women who are
Yeah.
pioneering all of this sort of next gen activism that we need right now on the ground, laying the groundwork
Yep.
for reimagining all of these social structures all across, the realms of social justice and social
Yeah.
issues. And it is good to see because
It is good to
it's
see.
one way I feel like of breaking down those silos,
Well, and I
between
know that a lot yeah, I know that a lot of people, like, there are a lot of white women right now talking about domestic inequality, and they're talking about it in the language of, early '70s Marxist feminists, right? That took 50 years, but it happened. But the thing that's dangerous about that to white Christian patriarchy in America is that they understand how important it is to have domestic inequality. They don't call it domestic inequality, they call it complementarianism. But if you have women refusing to do that, and you have daughters who won't transfer white male supremacist values to the next generation, you go into the panic that we're seeing right now, right? Because the only way you maintain white supremacy is if you get women to do it, right? So if
Yeah,
they can't have abortions and they can't get birth control and they can't work and they can't go to school, which is basically Project 2025, then the only way to maintain that is through violence. But otherwise, it's a pretty risky situation, you know?
yeah, and I mean, thank you so much for giving us a guidebook to how to refuse it, to how to defy it, to how to name it and see it, and tell everyone else that we know about it once we do.
Well,
And yeah, just
thank
this
you.
was such an important book. Everyone buy.
Thank
All we
you.
want is everything. And thank you so much for being here and for talking with
Thank you
me
for
about
doing this with me. I'm so excited. I'm so glad you're on Substack now and ready to,
it.
please.
Me too. What a fun way to kick
Brilliant.
it all off.
I know. It's a great way to kick it off, and I'm happy we're all here. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Yes, thank you everyone who's
Really.
here. And yeah, everyone
Yeah.
go out and follow Soraya and get the book and give it to all of the feminists and male
Pick the three
supremacists in
men.
your
Three, pick three men. This is a friend of mine was like, this is my mission for the holidays. They might not read it, but they can't avoid seeing it.
Exactly. And even if they only want to read a few pages, there's these pages of statistics that might do a
That's
really
true.
good job at just giving them the top line of what they need to
That's
know.
true. That's
Um,
true. We call it the bare minimum. Bare minimum table.
oh my God. Thank you so much, Soraya. And
Thank
thank
you,
you,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye.